Hey guys, tonight we slip into the soft, flickering lamplight of a palace in ancient Macedon. You hear the faint clatter of amphorae being moved in the storerooms, the murmur of tutors rehearsing their lessons, and the restless shuffle of a boy who doesn't exactly enjoy sitting still for hours. That boy, of course, is Alexander. Though you, as the dreamer in this story, might as well be sitting cross-legged beside him, straining to follow along as Aristotle drones on about ethics, logic, and why you should not base your entire worldview on whether olives are tasty. Already, the room smells faintly of ink and wax tablets, and the sense is clear. This child is being prepared for something larger. Larger than you, larger than his classmates, larger than his own patience with Greek grammar drills. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, what time is it for you, and where in the world are you tuning in from? I love seeing our little sleepy community stretching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in Pella, the capital of Macedon. The air carries a mix of horse sweat from the stables and fresh bread from the kitchens, a strangely soothing combination. Alexander grows up in a palace buzzing with intrigue, with his mother Olympias whispering stories of divine parentage, that he might just be descended from Achilles, or perhaps even fathered by Zeus himself. No pressure, right? You look over and notice Alexander absorbing these tales with wide eyes. He is a boy destined for greatness, or at least for serious therapy sessions, if he'd been born a few millennia later. His childhood isn't exactly all marble columns and lyres. There are moments of play too. You picture him running across courtyards, tossing javelins that are far too large for his tiny arms, and trying to outride older boys on horses that clearly do not appreciate being used as props in childhood dares. Historians still argue whether he showed genuine brilliance from the start, or whether later chroniclers polished his image into perfection like a marble bust. What's certain is that he had a stubborn streak a mile wide, and when you're 10 years old in a royal household, that's both adorable and terrifying. There's one quirky tidbit that always makes you smile. His favorite bedtime story, allegedly, was about Achilles. Imagine being tucked in with a tale not of bunnies or fairylands, but of a hero sulking in his tent because someone stole his girlfriend's honor. You pull the blanket closer, thinking you probably wouldn't sleep well after that one, but Alexander drifted off, dreaming of heroism. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you tried to live the way he planned to. Sword in hand, destiny looming, sandals perpetually dusty. Education plays a massive role. You sit through lessons with Aristotle himself, the famous philosopher who takes time away from categorizing plants and debating metaphysics to lecture a restless royal boy. Picture the classroom. Scrolls piled high, Aristotle's robes rustling, Alexander tapping his foot impatiently, secretly wishing he could be outside practicing with a spear. You might find it oddly comforting that even future conquerors suffer through homework. Aristotle teaches him about geography, ethics, biology, everything a young man would need to rule wisely, or at least to sound clever at dinner parties. Historians still debate how much of Aristotle's moral teaching stuck with him, considering Alexander later burned down cities while insisting he was civilizing them. You watch the boy learning languages too. Greek, naturally, but also the dialects of neighboring peoples. He is sharp-eared, quick-tongued, and fascinated by stories of faraway lands. Imagine him asking about India, about the edges of the world where maps turn blank and sea monsters allegedly swim. You nod off a little, soothed by the rhythm of his curiosity. The palace halls echo with the footsteps of envoys and warriors, and you sense how Alexander's childhood is a constant rehearsal for power. He is shown how to handle weapons, how to address soldiers, how to make sacrifices to the gods with solemn gestures. One day he slices the air with a sword too heavy for him. The next he listens to musicians plucking lutes that sound like trickling water. The contradiction is soothing. You know this child is being trained for everything, because no one quite knows what he'll need. And then there are the horses. Horses everywhere. You smell the hay, feel the warm breath of animals nudging for apples. Alexander is already drawn to them, though not all of them appreciate him. His early struggles in the stables foreshadow one of his most famous moments. Taming Bucephalus, the wild horse everyone else thought untamable. But that story belongs a little later. For now, picture a young boy peeking over stable doors, determined to figure out how to make these beasts his allies. You watch him linger, running his hands over their manes, whispering in their ears as though they already share some secret. The atmosphere of Pella is both cozy and dangerous. Cozy because you're wrapped in the rhythms of palace life. Meals at long wooden tables, flickering oil lamps at dusk, servants bustling quietly. Dangerous because whispers of politics snake through every corner, alliances, rivalries, enemies beyond the borders. Alexander absorbs all of it like a sponge soaking up both honey and vinegar. He doesn't yet wield power, but he's learning how it feels, how it tastes, how it must eventually be his. And perhaps the most human detail, Alexander keeps a copy of Homer's Iliad with him, annotated and worn. You glance over his shoulder and see scribbles, favourite lines underlined, moments of heroism circled. It's his bedtime story, his inspiration, his constant companion. One could argue that his entire adult life is just an elaborate fan fiction where he gets to play Achilles. You might chuckle softly at that thought before your eyelids grow heavier. The boy in front of you yawns, stretches, and leans back against the marble column. He doesn't yet know how many rivers he will cross, how many cities will rise with his name stamped across them, how many soldiers will follow him into the ends of the earth. But in this moment, in this palace hallway, he is still just a child. You feel the hush of night settling over the Macedonian capital, and you drift with him into dreams. You wake into another day in the palace, where sunlight pours through narrow windows and catches on polished bronze shields stacked in the corner. The boy Alexander is taller now, still restless, still sharp-eyed, but his world is increasingly defined by the shadow of one man, his father, King Philip II of Macedon. You find yourself trailing after them both, like a quiet observer moving between torchlight and trumpet calls, watching the son measure himself against a father who seems larger than life. Philip is no mere palace figurehead. He is the man who has taken a fragile kingdom on the northern edges of Greece and turned it into a disciplined machine of war. You hear the thud of spears as soldiers drill outside, their new long pikes, sarissas, pointing forward in a bristling porcupine of wood and steel. Philip reorganizes armies with such precision that even sleep-deprived historians later have to admit he knew what he was doing. And you, standing beside Alexander, can feel the pressure of that legacy pressing down like heavy armor. Mainstream fact slides in easily here. Philip's reforms made the Macedonian phalanx nearly unbeatable in open battle. Soldiers trained to move as one, their shields overlapping, their pikes a forest of points that kept enemies at bay. It's the sort of innovation that changes the entire balance of power. And Alexander, as a boy, watches these demonstrations with wide-eyed fascination, as if the drills were lullabies in steel. But here's the quirky tidbit you didn't expect. Philip apparently enjoyed the company of poets and performers as much as he did generals. One moment he might be plotting a siege, the next, listening to an actor recite Euripides. You imagine Alexander sitting nearby, watching his father laugh at tragic lines or reward a particularly moving speech with a jug of wine. For Alexander, this must have been confusing. Was greatness forged with spears or with words? Maybe both. You can sense Alexander both admiring and resenting his father. admiring the victories, the prestige, the sheer charisma, resenting that Philip always seems to get there first. You picture him pacing in the courtyard, kicking at pebbles, muttering about how he'll one day surpass even this towering figure. Historians still argue whether Alexander's ambition was born from love, rivalry, or insecurity. Was he desperate to outshine Philip, or simply destined to continue what his father began? You shrug, because either way, you can feel the weight of that inheritance already settling onto Alexander's young shoulders. You follow him into the grand hall, where maps of Greece and Asia are laid out across wooden tables. Philip leans over them, pointing with his dagger, explaining where alliances must be made and where rebellions must be crushed. Alexander listens, nodding, and sometimes interrupts with questions that are too bold for his age. Imagine the awkward silence in the room when a teenager corrects the king on strategy. Yet Philip often lets him speak, which is either a sign of indulgence or of recognizing a spark worth nurturing. The campaigns roll in like tides. Philip wins victory after victory, binding Greek city-states together, some willingly, most less so. You hear the echo of the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip leads Macedon to triumph against Athens and Thebes. And there, among the cavalry, Alexander himself, barely 18, commands a wing of the army, striking with ferocity that already makes soldiers whisper. You sense that the boy is becoming the man, though he is still under Philip's looming figure. The household, however, is not all discipline and glory. You glimpse quarrels between Philip and Olympias, Alexander's mother, a woman as fiery as any general. She tells her son repeatedly that his true father is Zeus, not Philip, a bedtime reassurance or perhaps a cunning bit of emotional manipulation. You imagine Alexander lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if thunderbolts might one day confirm the claim. At banquets, Philip grows rowdy, his drinking bouts notorious. You sit uncomfortably at the table as goblets clink, arguments flare, and loyalties are tested in the haze of wine. One evening, an insult thrown at Olympias makes Alexander leap to her defense, nearly drawing his sword against his own father. Picture the awkward family reunion after that spat, the king wobbling from drink, the prince storming out, the courtiers trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a royal soap opera. You let out a quiet chuckle, because if you thought your family dinners were tense, this one takes the olive cake. Still, in the quiet hours, Alexander learns. He listens to veterans speak of strategy, to courtiers whisper of politics, to philosophers mutter about destiny. He absorbs all of it, shaping an identity that is equal parts warrior, dreamer, and impatient heir. You can sense the impatience most of all. He is waiting for his turn, his chance, his moment when Philip's shadow will no longer stretch across every step. And in those same hours, Philip continues to expand Macedon's reach. He begins preparing for the greatest campaign yet, the invasion of Persia. You glance at Alexander and catch the flicker of excitement in his eyes. The boy raised on Homer, who idolized Achilles, who doodled battle plans in the margins of Aristotle's lectures, is now within touching distance of the grand adventure he's always dreamed of. The trouble is, he still isn't the one in command. At night, lying on your makeshift pallet in the palace, you hear the muffled footsteps of Alexander pacing again. He cannot sleep, restless as always, perhaps already imagining himself in command, riding ahead of columns of men, banners flapping, trumpets calling. The shadow of Philip looms, but Alexander is already rehearsing how to outshine it. The flickering lamps die down, the palace corridors grow still, and you feel yourself drifting with him, carried by the dual weight of admiration and rivalry. The father builds an empire, and the son dreams of eclipsing it. Somewhere in the silence, you sense that Alexander has already decided he won't just equal Philip. He will make the world forget there was ever a comparison. The courtyard smells of straw and sweat, and you feel the warmth radiating from sun-baked stones under your sandals. A horse nickers impatiently, hooves striking sparks as handlers struggle to control him. The animal is enormous, black as night with a white star marking its forehead, and its name, already whispered with exasperation, is Bucephalus. You stand close enough to feel the gust of hot breath from his nostrils, the shift of muscle under his hide, and the nervous tension running through everyone watching. You notice King Philip shaking his head, muttering that this horse is too wild, too expensive, and too dangerous. No one can mount him, no one can steady him, and the creature seems destined for rejection. Then Alexander steps forward. A slim teenager, his face still soft with youth, but eyes alight with determination. He insists that the horse is not unmanageable, only misunderstood. You might smirk quietly, thinking this is the sort of confidence you had at 16, usually before breaking something. Fact, ancient sources say Bucephalus was terrified of his own shadow. Trainers had tried to ride him, but each attempt ended in chaos. Alexander, though, notices the quivering ears, the rolling eyes, and realizes the animal fears the dark form always flickering at its side. So he does something simple and brilliant. He turns the horse toward the sun. With the shadow now trailing behind, Bucephalus calms. You watch the boy stroke the horse's mane, speak softly, and then, to everyone's astonishment, mount and ride across the courtyard. You hear the thud of hooves echoing like drums, the gasps of onlookers, and Philip's grudging admiration. Legend has it the king told his son, "Macedon is too small for you. Seek a kingdom equal to yourself." You picture Alexander, cheeks flushed with triumph, probably resisting the urge to smirk too visibly. For a teenager, that line must have felt like being handed permission to dream of world domination. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into this tale. Bucephalus wasn't just any horse. His name translates to ox head, possibly because of the shape of his wide forehead or the size of his frame. Imagine introducing your majestic warhorse with a name that sounds like Big Cow Face. Yet Alexander's devotion made the name glorious, turning a clumsy nickname into a symbol of loyalty. The bond formed that day lasts for decades. You picture Alexander brushing down Bucephalus in the stables at dusk, slipping him apples, confiding secrets as though the horse were a trusted friend. He will ride him into countless battles across mountains, rivers, deserts, and myths. And later, when Bucephalus dies, Alexander will name an entire city after him. That's not something you do for just any steed. That's something you do for a soulmate on 4 legs. Historians still argue whether the story is exaggerated, a bit of propaganda to show Alexander's destiny glowing even in youth. Did he really tame the horse in such dramatic fashion, or did court chroniclers polish the tale to match Homeric heroes taming beasts? You shrug, because whether or not it happened exactly that way, the story endured. And sometimes stories are more powerful than the bare bones of fact. As you follow Alexander away from the courtyard, the mood shifts. He's no longer just a boy in his father's shadow. He has proven himself capable of seeing what others miss, of turning obstacles into triumphs. His friends tease him, his enemies take note, and the palace corridors buzz with gossip. You feel the weight of that reputation forming, settling on his shoulders like a cloak. And yet he is still a teenager. You watch him later that night sprawled across cushions, listening to music, joking with companions, perhaps sneaking a glance at girls across the hall. He laughs easily, but his mind is always circling back to the horse, the victory, the way he caught the room's attention. He is hooked on that feeling. You know it's dangerous. Once someone tastes glory, sleep comes harder, dreams come louder. The next morning Alexander insists on riding Bucephalus himself, even against advice. The animal, though spirited, obeys him, trotting with smooth rhythm through Pella's streets. Children scatter out of the way, merchants stop to watch, and guards shake their heads in disbelief. You feel yourself riding along too, the steady sway of the saddle lulling you almost like a cradle. Perhaps this is why some viewers fall asleep so easily. Conquest, at least from the saddle, is strangely soothing. What the taming of Bucephalus truly shows is Alexander's gift for perception. While others saw danger, he saw fear. Where others imposed force, he offered understanding. And in that contrast lies a truth. The boy is not just another heir to a throne. He is someone who sees differently. You glance at the horse's calm eyes and realize you're looking at the beginning of a partnership that will gallop straight into legend. Later at dinner, Philip praises his son in front of nobles. The candles flicker, wine flows, and the atmosphere softens as Alexander basks in the rare approval. Yet Olympias, his mother, leans close and reminds him that divine lineage, not just horsemanship, marks him out for greatness. You stifle a laugh at the thought, what a household. Dad says good job with the horse. Mom says remember, you're Zeus's kid. Talk about mixed parenting strategies. Still, Alexander absorbs it all. You sense the gears turning in his head, already blending skill, destiny, and ambition into something combustible. He knows he can win loyalty not just with power, but with insight. He knows people will remember moments like this, retelling them for years, until even you, centuries later, are lulled to sleep by the tale. The night grows quiet, and the stable air is warm and sweet with hay. You hear Bucephalus shifting in his stall, a contented sigh of a horse finally understood. Alexander strokes his neck once more before slipping away to his chambers. You follow him with your eyes, the boy who saw through shadows, the boy who turned fear into friendship. The world does not yet know it, but it has just witnessed the spark of a conqueror's legend. And you? You let your breathing slow, rocked gently by the imagined rhythm of hooves fading into the distance. The palace has grown louder with the tread of boots and the ring of steel. You find yourself standing in a training field outside Pella, the dust rising in soft clouds as lines of young men practice maneuvers. The air smells of sweat, oiled leather, and roasted onions drifting from the soldiers' midday meal. And there, at the edge of the formation, a teenager steps forward to take command. Alexander, no longer just a boy with a clever trick about horses. Philip is away campaigning, and this is Alexander's chance to show that his lessons were not just theory. He's been given authority over a small force of men, more than a toy army, less than a kingdom's power. You walk beside him as he inspects their formation, calling out instructions in a voice that cracks slightly but grows stronger with each word. His tunic sticks to his skin under the sun. His hair clings damply to his forehead, and yet he seems completely absorbed. The mainstream fact comes into focus here. At the age of 16, Alexander was left as regent of Macedon while Philip fought elsewhere. That's right. Barely old enough to drive a chariot responsibly, and he's governing a kingdom. You picture yourself at 16, perhaps worrying about exams or acne, and compare that to Alexander issuing decrees, commanding troops, and quashing rebellions. The contrast is both humbling and a little absurd. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Alexander didn't just govern passively. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, he didn't hesitate. He led a campaign, stormed their stronghold, and founded a city on the site, naming it, with charming modesty, Alexandropolis. You imagine the town council meetings. Yes, welcome to Alexandropolis, founded by Alexander, ruled by Alexander, and probably decorated with statues of Alexander. Humble he was not. Still, as you drift along behind him, you sense how nervous the soldiers are. Following a boy is risky. Soldiers trust experience, not youthful confidence. But Alexander surprises them. He is fearless in the saddle, quick to adapt, and endlessly restless. He drills them harder than they expect, then marches with them instead of watching from a throne. You hear murmurs of respect growing like a campfire crackling. Historians still argue whether these early commands were truly decisive, or whether later chroniclers exaggerated them to show that Alexander was destined for greatness from the start. Some say his regency was minor. Others insist it set the tone for his entire career. You shrug. What matters to you, standing there in the dusty field? is how the young prince carries himself, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward, as though the world has already opened before him. He loves the details of command. You see him fiddling with maps by torchlight, arranging cavalry placements with pebbles and twigs, rehearsing speeches he'll deliver before battle. The soldiers laugh when he stumbles over words, but they notice the effort. He is, after all, trying to win them as much with charisma as with orders. One evening, after a particularly long drill, he joins them by the fire, tearing bread with his hands, drinking watered wine, and asking questions about their families. This is not typical behavior for royalty. You feel the warmth spread through the group, the grudging realization, this boy might actually lead us well. And of course, he makes mistakes. You watch him order a maneuver too complex, leaving the lines tangled and the soldiers muttering. He flushes, reorders them, and runs the drill again until it works. The embarrassment lingers, but the persistence impresses. You think back to your own teenage errors and feel oddly comforted. Apparently, even world conquerors endure awkward learning curves. The campaigns against Thracians and neighbouring rebels give him his first taste of battle's rhythm. You can almost feel the thump of feet on the march, the sudden silence before a clash, the clamour when shields slam together. Alexander rides at the front, Bucephalus carrying him with fluid grace, and for the first time you sense his hunger is being fed. He wants more. He wants larger stages, wider horizons. When he returns victorious, Philip nods approval. The king rarely offers lavish praise, but his decision to entrust Alexander again and again with real responsibility speaks louder than words. You glimpse the flicker of pride in Alexander's eyes, quickly followed by a spark of defiance. Approval is nice, but surpassing Philip. That is the true goal simmering beneath his calm expression. Late at night, you find him in his quarters, oil lamp flickering, eyes scanning Homer's Iliad. He lingers on passages where Achilles commands men, where destiny carries heroes forward, where battles tilt on a single decision. You realize he's not just reading, he's practicing. Each line is a rehearsal, each verse a guideline for how he will one day carve his own legend. The walls of Pella close in on him. Even with the power of command, with victories under his belt, he is impatient. You feel it as he walks the palace halls, restless steps echoing, eyes on the horizon beyond the mountains. He has tasted authority, and it is not enough. He has heard stories of Persia, of wealth, of sprawling empires, and the thought of ruling just Macedon feels like being offered a single olive when he craves the whole grove. The soldiers whisper his name now with a mix of affection and awe. The nobles regard him with caution, sensing the spark of ambition. Olympias feeds his sense of destiny with murmurs of divine parentage, while Philip sharpens his skills with practical tests. And you, drifting through the long days, recognize that a path is being carved, step by step, order by order, stone by stone. The campfires die down, the stables grow quiet, and the night air cools. Alexander lies awake, rehearsing tomorrow's drills, tomorrow's speeches, tomorrow's victories. His fingers trace the lines of the map beside his bed, following rivers he has never seen, mountains he has never crossed. You feel your own breathing slow as you watch him, already half in dreams of conquest, already living in a world too large for the room around him. The palace corridors echo with hurried footsteps, hushed voices, and the scrape of daggers against scabbards. You sense the tension in the air immediately. Something has changed, something irreversible. Philip II, the towering king whose shadow stretched over every corner of Macedon, has been assassinated. One moment, a triumphant ruler preparing to march on Persia, the next, cut down at a wedding procession by a disgruntled bodyguard. You can almost hear the collective gasp of the court, the rustle of cloaks as everyone tries to decide whether to mourn sincerely or calculate quickly. You stand at the edge of the hall, watching Alexander step forward into the void. He is just 20 years old, barely out of adolescence, and yet all eyes swivel to him. The throne may be his by right, But in a world of sharp blades and sharper politics, nothing is guaranteed. You might even shiver a little, as though the marble floors beneath you have suddenly turned slick with uncertainty. Mainstream fact: Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, stabbed by one of his own guards. The motives remain murky. Was it personal revenge, a conspiracy involving Olympias, or perhaps something orchestrated by enemies within the court? Historians still argue whether Alexander himself had any foreknowledge, though no evidence sticks. What is certain is that the moment Philip fell, Macedon teetered between chaos and continuity. The quirky tidbit: ancient gossip suggested that Olympias, Alexander's formidable mother, placed a golden crown on the assassin's corpse before it was executed. Imagine the awkwardness of that gesture. Your husband murdered, the killer sprawled in the dirt, and you giving him a royal send-off. If true, it paints Olympias less as a grieving widow and more as a queen sharpening her son's future. For Alexander, the immediate problem is survival. Rivals lurk in every corner. Nobles grumble, neighboring states scent weakness, and his father's generals weigh whether to pledge loyalty or seize the throne themselves. You picture Alexander moving through the palace like a cat through tall grass, alert, cautious, but brimming with fierce determination. He acts quickly. First, he secures the loyalty of the army. You watch him stride into camp, the soldiers still murmuring about Philip's death. He addresses them plainly, reminding them of his victories, of his bloodline, of the future campaigns already in motion. He doesn't beg, he commands, and in the steady nods of veterans you see his authority take root. The army, once Philip's tool, is now Alexander's. Next, he turns to the court. Rivals whisper, but he quashes dissent with swiftness that makes you blink. Potential claimants to the throne vanish, banished, executed, or folded neatly into silence. It feels ruthless, but necessary. You imagine the soft clink of wine cups in the palace that evening, courtiers pretending not to notice the empty seats at the table. Thebes, Athens, and other Greek city-states hear of Philip's death and decide to test the young king. You sense the tension rising, but Alexander responds with speed. He marches south, the rhythm of boots on stone roads echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. In Athens, politicians hesitate. In Thebes, defiance sparks. The boy king is about to show whether he truly commands respect. But before that storm, there's a moment of fragile quiet. You follow Alexander into the palace gardens. The night air smells of cypress and wet earth. He kneels briefly at an altar, making offerings to Zeus, perhaps to Apollo, perhaps even to Achilles, his ancestor, at least in story if not in fact. His face is lit by lamplight, sharp features softened by the glow. For a moment you see the weight pressing down, the enormity of filling Philip's boots. You think to yourself, you probably wouldn't survive this level of pressure. Most of us struggle with grocery lists, let alone kingdoms collapsing into uncertainty. He rises, steadier now, his decision clear. He will not simply inherit Philip's legacy. He will surpass it. The Persian campaign his father dreamed of? Alexander will make it his own. The empire Philip forged? Alexander will turn it into something even the poets will struggle to describe, without yawning from exhaustion at its sheer size. The palace quiets as word spreads. The boy is king. Nobles nod, soldiers cheer, enemies reconsider. You sense the pivot, the way the air itself shifts to accommodate this new reality. The torchlight flickers and you feel as though history has just exhaled and reset. And yet shadows remain. Rumors swirl about Olympia's involvement in Philip's death. Others murmur that Alexander was too efficient in consolidating power, too swift to cut down rivals. Historians still debate whether his ascent was entirely reactive or partly orchestrated. But you, drifting through the halls with him, know that in moments of uncertainty, perception is everything. He appears decisive, and so he is king. As the night stretches on, you hear the muffled sounds of preparations, horses being saddled, armor being polished, messengers dispatched. The throne of Macedon is no longer empty. Alexander sits upon it, posture rigid, eyes burning with ambition. The boy who tamed Bucephalus, the teenager who commanded troops, the youth who grew restless in his father's shadow, he is gone. What remains is a king, impatient for conquest, restless for glory, certain that the world is waiting for his footsteps. You let your breathing slow in time with the torchlight dimming in the hall. The palace settles, the city sleeps, and Alexander, though his mind is racing with plans, is at last crowned. The hush of night folds around him like a cloak, and you drift into dreams of battles not yet fought, cities not yet built, empires not yet imagined. The throne room smells faintly of olive oil lamps and dust, but it crackles with tension. You watch Alexander sit tall on his father's seat, his face calm yet tight at the edges. Barely 20, and already his rule is tested. Whispers slither through the marble halls. The Greeks are restless, the tribes in the north are plotting, and even within Macedon, nobles are unsure whether this boy-king can hold them together. You feel that nervous energy in your chest, like standing at the edge of a cliff before deciding whether to jump. The first challenge comes quickly. News arrives that Thebes has revolted, hoping Philip's death means freedom. Athens, too, stirs with debate, weighing whether to join the rebellion. You can almost hear the murmured arguments in crowded marketplaces far away. Surely this Alexander cannot match Philip. Surely now is the time. You picture Alexander receiving the reports, lips curling into a smile that is half irritation, half excitement. At last, a chance to prove himself. Fact, in 335 BCE, Alexander moved with astonishing speed. He marched his army south, covering distances so quickly that Greek cities were stunned. One moment they heard rumors of rebellion, the next Macedonian troops were at their gates. Speed became his weapon, and you, trudging alongside dusty soldiers, marvel at how the days blur into nights, the road a continuous hum beneath your feet. But here's the quirky tidbit. Alexander didn't just rely on military force. At Delphi, when he sought a blessing from the oracle, the priestess at first refused, claiming it wasn't the proper day. Alexander, never one for patience, supposedly dragged her into the temple by her arm. She cried out, "You are invincible, my son." Alexander released her, satisfied that Apollo himself had declared his destiny. You can't help but chuckle. When the oracle won't cooperate, just improvise. As the army nears Thebes, tension mounts. The Thebans have fortified their walls, and their citizens chant defiantly from the battlements. You walk through Alexander's camp, smelling boiled grain and leather, hearing the low murmur of soldiers sharpening swords. Some veterans whisper doubts. He's young, untested in a major siege. But when Alexander addresses them, his words are crisp, steady, almost hypnotic. He reminds them of Macedon's might, of Philip's victories, and of his own bloodline, Achilles reborn, leading them to glory. You feel the shift, the ripple of belief catching fire. Historians still argue whether Alexander intended mercy or destruction at Thebes. Some say he hoped to scare them into surrender. Others believe he planned a brutal example from the start. What is certain is that when the assault began, it was swift and decisive. Siege towers rolled forward, ladders clattered against stone, and Macedonian troops poured into the city. You find yourself caught in the sensory blur, the crash of splintering gates, the acrid tang of smoke, the roar of thousands of voices colliding. By nightfall, Thebes lay in ruins. 6,000 dead, survivors sold into slavery, the city dismantled stone by stone. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, a curious gesture that feels almost poetic in itself. You wander through the rubble, lantern light flickering over broken statues and toppled columns, and you feel the eerie hush of a city silenced in a single day. It is harsh but effective. The rest of Greece looks on and trembles. Athens, once bold, suddenly finds reasons to negotiate rather than rebel. Other city-states fall silent, their ambitions extinguished. Macedon is secure, and Alexander's authority unquestioned. You realize that the boy has crossed a threshold. He is no longer merely inheriting power, he is wielding it with terrifying certainty. Yet in the stillness of camp that night, Alexander does not rest easily. You find him pacing the firelight, eyes shadowed, perhaps replaying the decision in his mind. Was it necessary to burn Thebes so thoroughly? Was there another way? Historians still debate whether he regretted it, whether he saw tragedy in the destruction or only triumph. You stand at the edge of his circle, watching the flicker of doubt, then watching it harden into resolve. From this moment the path is clear. Greece is subdued, Macedon is united, and the stage is set for the dream Philip had always nurtured, the invasion of Persia. Alexander inherits not just the throne, but also the grandest ambition of the age. You sense the restlessness in him grow, a fire that won't allow him to stay still. The Balkans are secure, Greece is quiet. Now he must look east, to the endless horizons beyond the Aegean. But before the ships are built, before the rivers are crossed, he lingers on the ruins of Thebes. You walk with him through charred streets, the silence punctuated only by the crackle of embers. Soldiers stand guard, prisoners shuffle in chains, and the air is heavy with smoke. Alexander pauses at a broken wall, runs his hand over the stone and exhales slowly. You can almost hear his thoughts that destiny is not gentle, that greatness demands sacrifices too heavy for sleep. As dawn breaks, he mounts Bucephalus, sunlight catching the bronze of his armor. The men cheer, the banners rise, and the army begins to march back north. Behind them, Thebes smoulders, a warning carved in fire. Ahead of them lies Asia, Persia, and a horizon as wide as Alexander's ambition. You feel your eyelids growing heavier as the rhythm of marching boots blends with your own breath, lulling you into a strange peace. The harbour smells of tar, salt, and freshly cut timber. You stand on the wooden planks, watching Macedonian ships bob gently in the Aegean waters, their sails furled, their oarsmen chatting quietly. Alexander is here too, his cloak snapping in the breeze, eyes fixed eastward. Beyond that horizon lies the Persian Empire, vast and glittering, the stage his father once dreamed of but never reached. Now it is his. You might shiver a little, not from the sea air, but from the sense that history itself is gathering momentum. The mainstream fact is clear. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed from Europe into Asia Minor with roughly 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Not the largest force by ancient standards, especially against the Persian Empire's immense resources, but disciplined, loyal, and hungry for glory. The numbers march in your mind like steady drum beats. 40,000 feet kicking up dust, 5,000 hooves striking sparks. You can almost hear the rhythm of sandals on stone as the soldiers board their ships. And here's the quirky tidbit. Alexander was the last person to leave Macedon. He supposedly lingered at the shrine of the god Heracles, offering sacrifices and praying for success. He also staged athletic contests and lavish feasts before departure, as if half the army needed a party just to survive the nerves of invading the greatest empire in the world. You imagine soldiers nervously eating extra figs, telling each other, "No, I'm not worried, I just really like figs." The crossing itself is brief, but symbolic. As you step onto Asian soil with Alexander, the crunch of gravel under your sandals feels strangely momentous. He leaps down from the ship, spear in hand, and drives it into the earth, proclaiming he has taken Asia with a spear. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but effective. The men cheer, and you feel your chest tighten at the sheer audacity of it. Historians still argue whether Alexander truly believed himself invincible, or whether this was careful theatre. Did he think the gods were on his side, or did he know men needed that belief to march behind him? The line between faith and performance blurs, and you find yourself lulled by the ambiguity. Either way, the soldiers buy it, and that's what matters. The first major test comes quickly, the Battle of the Granicus River. You trudge beside the Macedonian phalanx, the ground muddy beneath your feet, the river rushing ahead. The Persians wait on the far bank, cavalry glittering with bronze armor. Alexander doesn't hesitate. He leads his men straight into the river, water splashing up around shields, war cries mixing with the rush of current. The clash is fierce, but the Macedonian discipline holds. You hear the thunk of pikes striking, the neigh of horses collapsing, the shouted orders cutting through chaos. Fact again, Alexander nearly died at Granicus. A Persian noble swung an axe at his head, and only the timely intervention of his companion Cleitus, who cut the attacker down, saved him. You picture the moment vividly. Alexander's helmet dented, his breath caught in his throat, a reminder that destiny can wobble on the edge of one's swing. Yet afterward he brushes himself off and rides forward as if nothing happened, because conquerors don't pause for mortality. The victory secures Asia Minor. Cities begin to surrender, either awed or terrified. You wander through Sardis, where gold gleams in treasuries and citizens bow low. Alexander often spares those who submit quickly, positioning himself not just as conqueror but as liberator. He respects local customs, reinstates temples, and sometimes even leaves local rulers in charge. You sense the subtlety here. He's not just taking territory, he's building loyalty. And then the quirky detail that makes you chuckle. When Alexander reached the ancient city of Gordium, he was confronted with the famous Gordian knot, a massive tangled rope that supposedly could not be untied. Legend said whoever solved it would rule Asia. Rather than fiddling with the knot endlessly, Alexander simply sliced it in half with his sword. Problem solved. You smirk, thinking that's exactly the kind of life hack you'd wish you could get away with. Skip the puzzle, declare victory anyway. Historians still argue whether he cut it or cleverly unfastened it, but you like the sword swipe version better. The march continues. You trudge dusty roads, pass fields of barley shimmering in the sun, and sleep under stars brighter than any lamp. The soldiers joke by the fires, sharing bread and dried meat, muttering about home, but following Alexander with an almost hypnotic devotion. The rhythm of the campaign begins to soothe you. Wake, march, fight, feast, march again. The monotony is broken only by sudden bursts of brilliance, when Alexander rides ahead, his cloak snapping, his spear pointing, and the men follow as if drawn by a magnet. At night, you sit with him near a campfire. He studies maps, eyes reflecting the flames, tracing lines across territories he has not yet seen. He listens to scouts report on terrain, nods, and then recites lines from Homer, reminding everyone, including himself, that he is walking in the footsteps of heroes. You hear the soldiers sigh contentedly, reassured that their leader isn't just a man, but a myth in progress. The breeze cools, the stars spin slowly overhead, and you feel your own breath fall into rhythm with the armies. Asia stretches endlessly ahead, Persia looms like a giant shadow, but for now the camp is quiet. Alexander leans back against Bucephalus, eyes half closed, and even the restless conqueror seems almost ready for sleep. You too let the lull of marching feet and crackling fire carry you gently into dreams. The morning haze clings to the foothills, and you hear the muffled sounds of soldiers shifting their armor, tightening straps, and testing spear points against the earth. The camp stirs slowly, but Alexander is already awake, already pacing, already thinking of the day ahead. His eyes are fixed toward the narrow coastal plain that stretches between the mountains and the sea, the place where two great armies are about to meet. You feel your heartbeat quicken as the air thickens with anticipation. The Battle of Issus is about to unfold. The mainstream fact is undeniable. In 333 BCE, Alexander faced the Persian king Darius III at Issus. Darius commanded a vastly larger force, some say hundreds of thousands, though historians still argue whether those numbers were inflated to make Alexander's victory look more miraculous. Either way, the Persian army outnumbered the Macedonians, their banners stretching like a field of poppies across the narrow plain. Yet Alexander had something else: terrain, discipline, and the will to gamble everything. Before the clash, Alexander walks among his men. You trail behind him, listening as he speaks with calm assurance. His voice is steady, laced with humour even. He reminds them that they are not merely fighting for Macedon, but for all of Greece, for the spoils of Persia, for glory that will echo beyond their lives. The soldiers grin, slap each other's shoulders, and you can sense their fear melting into a stubborn sort of pride. You might even chuckle when one soldier jokes that he'd rather face a Persian than go another night without fresh bread. Quirky tidbit. Darius, despite his overwhelming numbers, made a critical mistake. He chose to confront Alexander in a narrow space where his cavalry couldn't fully maneuver. It's like showing up to a marathon and then insisting on running it in your kitchen. Alexander sees the floor instantly and grins, the kind of grin that makes you uneasy because you know he's about to do something audacious. The battle begins. You step with the phalanx into the shallow river, cold water soaking your sandals, spears lowering in unison. Across the way, Persian arrows darken the sky, hissing like angry insects. The clash is deafening. Shields crash, horses rear, men shout. The smell of iron and sweat fills your nose. You try to steady your breathing, as though you too must hold the line. And then comes Alexander himself, riding at the head of the companion cavalry. Bucephalus charges forward, hooves splashing through the shallows, Alexander's spear aimed straight at the Persian centre. He leads not from behind, but from the very front, cloak whipping in the wind, a sight both terrifying and mesmerizing. You can almost hear the sharp intake of breath as soldiers surge forward, swept up by his audacity. The Persians falter. Despite their numbers, the narrow ground works against them. Macedonian discipline holds like a wall of stone. You glance toward the center, where chaos explodes around Darius. And then, in a moment that will echo through history, the Persian king loses his nerve. Darius turns his chariot and flees the field, leaving his army stunned. You can almost hear the collective gasp, an emperor abandoning his men. Fact again, Alexander captured Darius's family after Issus, his wife, mother, and daughters. Instead of treating them cruelly, he showed remarkable restraint, even courtesy. He assured them they were safe, behaving less like a conqueror and more like a host. Historians note this moment as both political calculation and genuine magnanimity. You picture the Persian royal women staring at this young, mud-stained king, realizing he was both terrifying and oddly gallant. And then there's the quirky rumor. When Darius's mother mistakenly bowed to Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, Alexander gently corrected her, saying, "He too is Alexander." A charming slip, or perhaps an intentional gesture of friendship? Historians still argue whether it ever happened, but the story lingers like a soft smile in the middle of a battlefield. The aftermath is stunning. Alexander, with fewer troops, has beaten the king of Persia himself. His reputation soars across Asia. His men cheer until they are hoarse, their faith cemented forever. You walk among them as they feast that night, roasted lamb and wine flowing, laughter ringing out under the stars. Yet you notice Alexander sitting slightly apart, maps unfurled on his lap, eyes gleaming with restless ambition. Even in victory, he is already thinking of the next march. As the firelight flickers, you remember how Philip's shadow once loomed over him. Now it is Alexander who casts the shadow, longer, sharper, impossible to ignore. He has defeated the might of Persia in open battle, and still he is not satisfied. You lean back against a log, the distant waves lapping the shore, the soft hum of soldiers singing drunkenly by the fire. The exhaustion of battle settles into your bones, but there is also an odd comfort in the rhythm of conquest. March, fight, feast, dream, repeat. The night grows colder. The stars burn bright above the battlefield that now lies silent, scattered with broken spears and abandoned shields. Alexander paces once more before retiring, his figure silhouetted against the embers. You let your eyes follow him for a moment, then drift closed, carried into slumber by the steady hush of waves and the faint echo of victory still humming in the air. The smell of brine lingers on the air, mixed with pitch from shipyards and the faint metallic tang of weapons being repaired. You arrive at the coast of Phoenicia, and before you rises the island city of Tyre, gleaming, defiant, and very much unwilling to open its gates to Alexander. The year is 332 BCE, and you are about to watch one of the most audacious sieges in ancient history. Mainstream fact first. Tyre was an island fortress, about half a mile from the mainland, surrounded by tall walls and confident in its navy. When Alexander asked politely to enter and offer sacrifices in the temple of Melkart, the Tyrians replied with a firm no. You picture the awkward silence that followed, then Alexander's tight smile as he decided that no was not an acceptable answer. The quirky tidbit that makes you grin. Instead of giving up, Alexander ordered his men to build a causeway, literally a land bridge, out into the sea. You stand beside workers hauling stones, timber, and rubble, dropping them into the shallow water. Day after day, the causeway creeps closer to Tyre, like a slow-motion arm reaching out to grab the city. Soldiers joke that they've traded their spears for shovels, their armor for blisters. You imagine the grumbling. We signed up to conquer Persia, not to build piers. Historians still argue whether Alexander's decision was reckless genius or sheer stubbornness. Constructing a half-mile causeway under enemy fire seems insane, yet the project kept going. Tyrian ships harassed the builders, archers rained arrows, and Alexander responded by constructing massive siege towers right on the causeway. Picture them rolling forward, creaking wooden giants taller than the city's walls, bristling with catapults. It's both terrifying and oddly theatrical, like watching someone wheel a skyscraper into battle. You walk along the half-finished causeway, feeling the planks sway beneath your feet. The sea breeze tugs at your cloak, salt stinging your lips. Workers grunt, ropes creak, and somewhere above, flaming projectiles arc through the air, hissing as they strike the water. The soldiers mutter that Tyre has become less of a siege and more of a construction nightmare. Yet Alexander pushes them onward, promising glory, promising loot, promising that no fortress is beyond reach. Months pass. You hear the constant rhythm of hammering, sawing, splashing stones into the sea. Nights are filled with torchlight, the glow reflected on restless waves. Tyre sends out fire ships to burn the towers, and you watch Alexander respond by cobbling together even larger defenses. It becomes a game of escalation, each side raising the stakes until even you feel dizzy at the absurd determination involved. The quirky human detail. Alexander didn't just watch from afar. He joined the builders, hauling stones, encouraging his men by showing he would blister his own hands alongside them. You picture him lugging a rock, probably smaller than what a veteran could manage, but still enough to send a message. The conqueror himself sweats and strains with the workers, try not to smile at the thought of the world's greatest general moonlighting as a day labourer. Finally, after 7 long months, the causeway reaches the walls. The assault begins. Siege engines hurl stones, towers grind forward, and soldiers scramble up ladders under a rain of missiles. You hear the thunder of waves smashing against the new land bridge, the clash of steel, the roar of voices echoing across the sea. Slowly, impossibly, the Macedonians break through. Fact again, once the city fell, it was brutal. Thousands of Tyrians were killed and many more sold into slavery. Alexander, however, spared those who sought refuge in temples, a curious blend of ferocity and piety. The city that had prided itself on being unconquerable was now part of his growing empire. Historians still debate whether Alexander's siege of Tyre was primarily strategic, securing a naval base, or symbolic, a demonstration that no city could defy him and survive. You stand in the rubble, the smoke still curling upward, and realize it was probably both. He wanted ships, but he also wanted fear to march ahead of his army like a herald. That night, the army celebrates. You hear the crackle of fires, the laughter of soldiers relieved that the ordeal is finally over. Bread and wine are shared, and some men fall asleep almost instantly, sprawled on the sand as the waves lap nearby. Alexander, though, does not rest. He walks the shoreline, gazing east again, his mind already moving past Tyre to the next horizon. His ambitions are endless, and the sea cannot stop him. You find yourself sinking into the rhythm of waves, the gentle hush of water washing against the newly built causeway. The air is salty, the stars spread across the night sky, and though the city lies broken, the sound of the tide soothes you. You close your eyes, letting the image of Alexander's silhouette against the sea fade into darkness, his figure already marching onward in your dreams. The desert air is sharp and dry, carrying a faint sweetness of date palms and the heavier scent of dust baking in the sun. You find yourself moving south with Alexander's army, away from the rubble of Tyre and into the ancient land of Egypt. The year is still 332 BCE, and for once the march feels less like a campaign and more like a pilgrimage. The Persians have ruled here, but resentment simmers among Egyptians, and when Alexander enters, they greet him not as a conqueror but as a liberator. You feel the surprising softness of welcome in the air, no clashing of shields, just garlands and open gates. The mainstream fact: Alexander was crowned pharaoh at Memphis. The priests, robes white against the golden sun, declared him the son of Amun, aligning him with divine kingship stretching back centuries. You watch the ritual, incense curling upward, chants weaving through the temple columns. Alexander stands tall, his face illuminated by lamplight, and for a moment he seems less a Macedonian soldier and more a timeless figure absorbed into Egyptian myth. And here's the quirky tidbit. Alexander founded a city during his Egyptian stay, one that would outlast empires, Alexandria. Imagine him pointing at the coastline, squinting against the glare and declaring, "Yes, right here." The plan was laid out with broad streets and a great harbour, though he probably didn't lose sleep over zoning laws. You smile, thinking how many rulers dream of cities bearing their names, yet only Alexander managed to plant one that still thrives today, thousands of years later. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely embraced Egyptian religion or merely performed what was politically wise. Did he believe the priests when they called him son of Ammon, or did he nod politely while already planning his next campaign? As you watch him kneel at temples and offer sacrifices, the ambiguity lingers. Sincerity or strategy, sometimes the two are indistinguishable. The most mystical episode unfolds when Alexander journeys into the Libyan desert to the oracle of Siwa. You travel with him across endless dunes, sand whispering underfoot, the sun relentless. Soldiers mutter nervously, wondering if they'll run out of water. And then, as legend tells it, a storm sweeps across the desert, guiding the caravan, or perhaps obscuring it, until at last the oasis appears, a mirage made real. Inside the shrine, the oracle greets Alexander. What exactly was said remains a mystery. Some claim the priest addressed him as son of Zeus Ammon. Others insist he received reassurance that he would conquer the world. You lean closer, straining to hear words that history has muffled, but all you catch is Alexander's expression, satisfied, serene, as though divine confirmation had just been whispered in his ear. Historians still debate whether it was prophecy, flattery, or simply the echo of Alexander's own ambition reflected back at him. When he emerges from the temple, the desert wind tugs at his cloak, and you sense his certainty has deepened. He is not merely king of Macedon, not merely general of armies, he is pharaoh of Egypt, son of Zeus, chosen of destiny. You sigh softly, realizing that humility has long since been left behind. Life in Egypt feels gentler after months of sieges. You stroll through bustling markets, smelling honey cakes and grilled fish, listening to merchants barter in a mix of Greek and Egyptian. Soldiers wander freely, marveling at obelisks and pyramids that dwarf anything back home. Some carve their names into ancient stone, a humble attempt at immortality beside monuments already thousands of years old. You can't help but chuckle at the thought of a bored Macedonian scratching, "Doros was here," on the side of a pyramid. The Nile soothes you. At dusk, its waters glimmer in muted gold, papyrus reeds swaying gently. The army camps along its banks, soldiers washing off the dust, children from nearby villages staring wide-eyed at foreign warriors. The air is calm, the pace unhurried, and even you begin to feel that rarest of sensations on campaign, peace. And yet, Alexander cannot sit still. By day he consults engineers about Alexandria's foundations. By night he studies maps of Persia. His ambition is like the river itself, restless, winding, relentless. Egypt is secure, the people honor him. The gods, apparently, favor him, but his gaze is already tilting eastward again. Still, there are moments of intimacy. You watch him walk alone among the temples, touching carvings of falcons and ankhs, listening to hymns in a language he doesn't fully know. He seems absorbed, perhaps humbled, perhaps just curious. He lingers at the base of a sphinx, staring at its silent face, and for once even Alexander looks small. As night settles over the desert, the stars blaze brighter than any torch. You lie back on warm sand, the faint hiss of the wind in your ears, and you watch Alexander silhouetted against the horizon, a lone figure framed by infinite sky. Egypt has embraced him, crowned him, mythologized him, and yet he is already moving on. You close your eyes, letting the desert hush fold around you, as though the sand itself were lulling you into sleep. The night air is crisp, and you can feel the hum of anticipation vibrating through the camp. Torches flicker, maps lie stretched across wooden tables, and Alexander leans over them, his finger tracing the plains near a place called Gaugamela. It is 331 BCE, and you sense that this will not be just another battle. This is the showdown. Alexander's smaller army against the might of Darius III's Persian Empire, gathered in force to crush him once and for all. The mainstream fact: at Gaugamela, Darius assembled an enormous host, perhaps 200,000, maybe even more, depending on which ancient source you believe. Historians still argue about the numbers, but all agree it dwarfed Alexander's roughly 47,000 men. And yet, here you stand, feeling not fear but a strange steadiness radiating from the Macedonian camp. They know their phalanx, their cavalry, their king. They know the man who will ride into the thick of the storm alongside them. The quirky tidbit: Darius even had the battlefield specially prepared. His engineers flattened the ground so his war chariots, fitted with blades on their wheels, could charge more effectively. Imagine spending weeks landscaping a battlefield, only for your opponent to ruin the plan with clever maneuvers. You can't help but smirk at the thought. Battlefield as construction project, complete with ancient Persian paving crews. On the eve of battle, Alexander walks among his soldiers. You trail behind him, listening as he tells jokes, praises their loyalty, and reassures them with casual confidence. He dines with them, not separately, and when a veteran complains about blisters, Alexander lifts his own sandal to show identical sores. The laughter spreads like fire through dry grass, and you realize his charisma isn't just speeches. It's shared suffering, shared humanity. Dawn arrives. The sky glows pink over the plain, and the Persian army stretches to the horizon like a glittering sea. Cavalry, infantry, elephants, and chariots, more than you can count. You take a deep breath, the cool morning air tinged with dust and anticipation. Alexander rides Bucephalus to the front lines, his companion cavalry shimmering in polished bronze. The men fall silent as he raises his arm, pointing toward the endless Persian host, and declares, "The world is ours to take." The battle begins with the thunder of hooves. Darius sends his chariots surging forward, wheels flashing, blades spinning. For a moment, it looks terrifying, unstoppable machines tearing toward the Macedonian lines. But Alexander has prepared. You watch as his soldiers simply open their ranks, the chariots rolling harmlessly through gaps while spears thrust from either side. Horses panic, drivers fall, and the mighty chariots sputter out like toys. Then the real clash begins. Arrows darken the sky, cavalry slams into cavalry, and the phalanx advances step by step, pikes bristling like a forest on the move. The noise is overwhelming. The clang of shields, the grunt of men, the scream of horses. You grip your cloak tighter, imagining the sheer chaos, and yet you see Alexander at the heart of it, calm, calculating, waiting for the right moment. And then, like a hawk diving, he spots the opening. He leads the companion cavalry in a sudden charge, not against the flanks but directly toward the Persian center, toward Darius himself. Bucephalus gallops, dust streaming behind, Alexander's spear angled like lightning. For a heartbeat, it seems he might strike down the great king in single combat. But once again, Darius loses his nerve. He turns his chariot and flees, abandoning his men to collapse without their leader. The Persians scatter. Macedonian soldiers press forward, cutting through the vast army like water through sand. The battlefield becomes a swirl of flight and pursuit, and by nightfall Alexander holds the field. Darius is gone, Persia's power broken. You stand in the eerie silence after battle, the stars bright above a plain now littered with shields, broken spears, and the echoes of destiny fulfilled. Fact again, after Gaugamela, Alexander declared himself king of Asia. He entered Babylon in triumph, the city surrendering without resistance, its streets lined with cheering crowds. The treasure he seized was unimaginable enough to fund his campaigns for years. And unlike many conquerors, he treated Babylon with respect, restoring temples, honoring local customs, and presenting himself as chosen by their gods. The conqueror knew how to be a careful guest. The quirky human moment. When Alexander entered Babylon, the locals brought him offerings of flowers and animals, and one priest tried to hand him a massive golden crown. Alexander laughed, refused it politely, and placed it on the head of the statue of Marduk instead. Even at his most triumphant, he could still be playful, still perform little gestures that charmed the crowds. Historians still debate whether Gaugamela was Alexander's masterpiece of strategy or simply the result of Persian missteps. Was it genius or was it fortune? You, standing in the cooling desert night, know it was probably both. But what lingers is not the tactics. It's the feeling that Alexander, once a restless boy in Pella, has now toppled the greatest empire in the world. As the camp settles, soldiers feast on Persian spoils, drinking and singing until their voices grow hoarse. Alexander, however, sits apart with his generals, tracing new lines on his maps. His eyes gleam in the firelight, already fixed beyond Babylon, beyond Persia, toward horizons his men can scarcely imagine. You lie back on the sand, the earth still warm beneath you, and listen to the quiet murmur of the camp. The battle is over, the empire has shifted, and the night cradles you gently, as though the world itself has grown still to let you rest. Your eyelids grow heavy, and the plains of Gaugamela fade into dreams, vast and quiet, like an ocean at peace after a storm. The landscape shifts under your feet as you leave the lush cities of Mesopotamia behind. The rivers of Babylon fade into the memory of green fields and date palms, and now you trudge through the endless steppes and high, stony passes of Central Asia. The air grows thinner, the winds colder, and the paths more treacherous. You hear the crunch of gravel beneath sandals, the snort of horses climbing steep inclines, and the muttered curses of soldiers who thought the war was over after Babylon. Alexander's conquest is not finished. Not yet. The mainstream fact: after defeating Darius, Alexander pressed into Bactria and Sogdiana, regions that roughly map onto modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The Persians may have been broken, but these remote satrapies resisted fiercely. Local chieftains led guerrilla-style resistance, melting into mountains, striking supply lines, vanishing into valleys. Alexander, who had triumphed in grand battles, now faced the exhausting grind of chasing shadows. And here's the quirky tidbit. In one campaign through Sogdiana, Alexander supposedly captured a fortress perched on an impossible cliff. Locals taunted him, saying he'd need men with wings to reach it. Alexander, never one to let a dare slide, sent his best climbers up the cliffs at night. Using tent pegs and ropes, they scaled the sheer rock face. At dawn, they appeared on the summit, and the defenders, astonished at the sight, surrendered without a fight. You smirk, imagining those climbers later bragging, "Oh, wings? No problem, we brought ropes." Historians still argue whether these Central Asian campaigns strengthened Alexander's empire or merely drained his men. Some see them as necessary for securing his rear before marching farther east. Others think they were quixotic, born of stubborn pride. You walk alongside weary soldiers who grumble about endless marching, endless fighting, endless promises of victory. The sparkle of Babylon has faded, the reality of mountains and frost bites deeper. And yet in this harsh land, Alexander finds both challenge and love. You witness his meeting with Roxana, a local noblewoman of extraordinary beauty. The stories say he fell in love at first sight, perhaps during a banquet. He married her soon after, a political alliance, yes, but also, according to some accounts, genuine affection. You picture the wedding feast, torches flaring against stone walls, drums beating, Macedonian soldiers awkwardly joining Central Asian dancers, and Alexander smiling, perhaps for once at peace. The marriage surprises his men. Some grumble that their king should wed a Macedonian princess, not a foreigner. Others nod approvingly, seeing it as a clever way to bind local elites to the new empire. Alexander, as usual, ignores the discontent. He has always believed himself destined to merge worlds, not merely to conquer them. You feel the contrasts pile up around you. One day the army storms through a frozen pass, snow-blinding, breath-frosting in the air. The next you stumble into lush valleys filled with orchards and rivers, where locals watch nervously from a distance. Villages burn, then rebuild. Alliances are made, then broken. It's exhausting, and you feel the fatigue settling into your bones, just as the soldiers must have felt it, hungry, footsore, muttering that Persia was supposed to be the finish line. There's humour even here, though. Quirky detail. Alexander supposedly introduced the Macedonians to Central Asian fermented mare's milk, kumis. The soldiers, unused to the taste, gagged and joked that the drink was punishment disguised as hospitality. You picture them raising bowls reluctantly, faces twisting, while Alexander gulps it down with relish, proclaiming it a sign of friendship. You can't help but chuckle. Conquer the world, yes, but first, conquer your gag reflex. The resistance is stubborn. Leaders like Spitamenes wage a guerrilla war that tests Alexander's patience. For years, skirmishes drag on, fortresses fall and rise again. You trail behind the columns, the rhythm of marching boots broken by sudden shouts, ambushes, and desperate counterattacks. The soldiers grow restless, dreaming of returning home, but Alexander drives them onward, insisting that no corner of rebellion remain. At night, the campfires flicker against cold stone walls. Soldiers huddle in cloaks, chewing stale bread, staring into the flames. Alexander walks among them, speaking softly, sometimes quoting Homer, sometimes promising that the hardships will pass. You can almost feel the hypnotic pull of his words, the way he convinces exhausted men to rise again at dawn and march farther into the unknown. Historians still debate whether Alexander was losing himself in endless conquest, unable to stop, or whether he truly believed each step brought him closer to uniting East and West. You sigh, because perhaps it doesn't matter. The men follow, the empire expands, and history records his name carved across mountain ranges. Roxana remains by his side, a rare softness in a life of steel and dust. You glimpse them together, sharing quiet moments amid chaos. Her presence steadies him, though it also sparks jealousy among some of his companions. For Alexander, though, she becomes both wife and symbol, proof that his empire is not just Macedonian, but something larger, something fused from many worlds. As you descend into another valley, the stars spread wide above the steppes. The air is sharp, the earth cold, but the rhythm of hooves and boots soothes you. The endless campaign blurs into a lullaby of marching, climbing, fighting, resting, and moving again. You close your eyes, letting the sound of wind over the mountains wash over you, carrying you towards sleep like a gentle, restless tide. The ground beneath your sandals grows softer, warmer, the air suddenly heavier with moisture. After years of dust, stone, and desert winds, you arrive with Alexander's army at the lush edge of the Punjab. It is 326 BCE, and India lies before you, new, strange, and shimmering with possibilities. You hear the calls of unfamiliar birds, smell spices carried on the breeze, and see rivers wide and glimmering under a punishing sun. The men, weary from Central Asia, now face another horizon that seems to stretch forever. The mainstream fact: at the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander faced King Porus, who commanded a formidable army that included war elephants. For Macedonian soldiers who had never seen such beasts, the sight must have been terrifying. Giant creatures trumpeting, tusks gleaming, armored and ready to trample. You stand on the riverbank with the men, your breath catching as shadows loom through the misty rain. And here's the quirky tidbit. To cross the river undetected, Alexander staged a series of nightly feints, moving troops up and down so the Indians grew accustomed to the noise. Then, during a storm, he finally slipped across upstream. Imagine the soldiers slogging through mud, rain plastering cloaks to their backs, lightning flashing as they stumble forward, half exhausted and half exhilarated. It feels more like a midnight camping trip gone wrong than the prelude to a grand battle. When dawn breaks, the clash begins. You hear the pounding hooves of cavalry, the clash of shields, and then the earth-shaking roar of elephants charging into the fray. Macedonian horses shy in panic, soldiers stare wide-eyed, and for a moment it seems the line will break. You feel your pulse quicken. What would it be like to stand before a wall of tusks and tonnage bearing down on you? Alexander, of course, adapts. He orders his men to target the elephant handlers, turning the mighty beasts into confused hazards. The phalanx adjusts, spears flashing, pressing forward with grim determination. Slowly, the Macedonians gain ground. The elephants, maddened, trample friend and foe alike, and the battlefield becomes a chaos of mud, screams, and giant shadows thrashing in despair. Historians still argue how large Porus's army really was, and whether the elephants were decisive or symbolic. What is certain is that Alexander won, but in victory something unexpected happened. When Porus was brought before him, wounded but unbowed, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, like a king. Alexander, impressed by his dignity, granted him not only his territory, but even more besides, making him a loyal ally. You feel a strange warmth at this. After years of relentless conquest, here is a moment of respect, almost friendship. The quirky human detail. Accounts say Porus was so tall and broad that Alexander, normally fearless, had to look up at him like a child meeting a giant. You can't help but grin at the image. The conqueror of the world craning his neck, probably thinking, well, this guy could squash me like a grape. The aftermath of Hydaspes is bittersweet. The victory is clear, the alliance secured, but Alexander's men are exhausted. You hear their murmurs in camp that night. They have marched from Greece to India, fought in deserts, mountains and jungles, and they long for home. Even Alexander's charisma begins to falter against their bone-deep fatigue. You sense the tension building, like a bowstring stretched too tight. Still, Alexander cannot resist pushing farther. He dreams of reaching the ocean at the end of the world, of conquering lands no Greek has ever seen. You walk beside him as he studies maps under a flickering lamp, eyes hungry, fingers tracing rivers as though they are promises. Yet when he announces plans to march east again, the army resists. Veterans beg, officers protest, and finally, at the banks of the Hyphasis River, the men refuse to go farther. Historians still debate whether Alexander was truly shocked by this mutiny or whether he had sensed it coming. Some say he sulked in his tent for days, refusing to speak, like a child denied a toy. Others believe he accepted it with pragmatism. You, watching him sit alone by the river, see the tension in his jaw, the fury in his silence, but also the weight of reality pressing down. Even kings cannot drag unwilling men across the edges of the world, so, reluctantly, Alexander turns back. He orders massive altars built on the riverbank to mark the furthest point of his conquests, as if to say, "We could have gone farther. Remember that." The altars stand like stone bookmarks in the landscape, proof of ambition even when ambition must yield. The march south is grueling. Monsoon rains drench the army, rivers swell and disease spreads. You walk ankle-deep in mud, clothes heavy with water, listening to soldiers curse the sky. Supplies run short, villages resist. Yet Alexander pushes on, stubborn, driven, even as the dream of conquering the world slips further from his grasp. At night, in soggy camps, the men huddle under makeshift shelters, lightning flashing overhead. Alexander still visits them, still speaks of destiny, still quotes Homer, but the spark has dimmed. You feel it too. The journey is no longer triumph but endurance. And yet, in the rhythm of rain on canvas and the soft muttering of weary soldiers, there's a strange comfort, like the sound of waves lulling you towards sleep. The rains fade, the monsoon clouds lift, and you find yourself trudging with Alexander's army down toward the Indian Ocean. The march south after Hydaspes has been brutal. Mud, hunger, fever. But now the horizon opens wide, the salty tang of the sea drifting into camp. For the first time, the men see the edge of the subcontinent, and for a moment, even their exhaustion pauses. They've reached the waters Alexander always dreamed of touching. The mainstream fact. In 325 BCE, Alexander split his forces. Part of the army under Nearchus would explore the coastline by sea. Alexander himself would lead a march back west through the Gedrosian desert, a harsh gamble across one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Historians still argue why he chose this route. Was it pride? A desire to outdo Cyrus the Great, who had lost an army there centuries earlier? Or was it simply the fastest path back to Persia? The quirky tidbit. Before leaving India, Alexander staged massive sacrifices and athletic games on the shores of the ocean. Soldiers whooped, wrestled, raced, and feasted, their laughter carrying across the surf. You imagine the scene. Muddy, scarred veterans diving into the waves like carefree children, splashing and shouting while Alexander poured libations to Poseidon. For one night, the conqueror of Asia looked less like a general and more like a party host at the world's edge. Then the desert march began. You step into the Gedrosian wasteland with the men, and the air feels like it's being wrung straight out of your lungs. The sun burns mercilessly, the sand stings your eyes, and the horizon offers nothing but shimmering heat. The army struggles mile after mile, lips cracked, armor hot as a griddle. Supplies dwindle, water skins dry. Men collapse in the sand and horses stumble, their flanks heaving. You feel your own throat tighten just imagining it. And yet Alexander does not take the easy way out. He marches on foot with his men, sharing their suffering. One day a soldier brings him a helmet filled with precious water. Alexander looks at it then, in full view of the army, pours it into the sand. His men gasp, then cheer. If their king will thirst with them, they can endure. You might smile faintly at the sheer theatricality of it, half self-denial, half brilliant morale trick. Historians still argue whether the desert march was a disaster or a calculated statement of endurance. Thousands perished, yes, but Alexander emerged with his army's loyalty intact, his legend burnished by hardship. You walk beside the survivors, gaunt but unbroken, and you sense that their suffering has become part of the myth as much as any battle. Emerging from the desert, the army staggers into the greener lands of Persia once more. Relief floods camp like cool water. Villages welcome them, food flows again, and the men collapse under shade trees, laughing in disbelief that they are still alive. Alexander, though, looks thinner, sterner, eyes burning with an even harder light. The desert has carved him, tested him, perhaps even haunted him. the quirky human moment. Despite exhaustion, Alexander reportedly ordered grand processions and sacrifices once back in Persia, as if to erase the misery in a haze of ceremony. Imagine the soldiers rolling their eyes, muttering, "Really, after all that, another parade?" But still they followed, because at this point, Alexander's will was a force they could neither resist nor truly understand. In Babylon, news spreads of rebellions in other parts of the empire, and Alexander begins reorganizing his realm. He replaces satraps, punishes corruption, and introduces more Persians into positions of power. You walk with him through the grand halls, their walls glittering with glazed tiles of lions and gods, and you hear the murmurs. Some Macedonians are uneasy, feeling their king is becoming too Persian, too distant from his roots. At night, you sit in the gardens of Susa, fragrant with myrtle and roses. The soldiers lounge with cups of wine, telling stories of elephants, deserts, and impossible marches. Their voices are hoarse, their laughter soft. You feel the weight of years in their words, the longing for home woven with pride in what they've endured. Alexander passes among them, sometimes smiling, sometimes distant, as if he already walks half in another world. Historians still debate whether Alexander ever truly planned to stop, or whether each victory simply sharpened his hunger. You sigh quietly, because as the torches flicker and the warm Persian night hums with crickets, it feels clear that rest was never in his nature. The man who tamed Bucephalus as a boy has always been galloping forward, and he cannot pull the reins now. You let the night sounds settle into your ears, the whisper of leaves, the murmur of tired men drifting into sleep. The desert ordeal is behind you, Persia once more lies under his rule, but Alexander's story is not finished. You close your eyes, feeling the hush of the garden around you, and sense that darker chapters still wait just ahead. The halls of Babylon are cool and dim, shaded by columns painted with lions and gods. You trail behind Alexander as he strides through them, still restless even after the empire lies firmly in his grasp. The year is 323 BCE, and the world he has conquered seems almost too small to contain him. Yet beneath the splendor of the city, whispers of unease ripple through the air. His men are tired, his generals are wary, and his ambitions, impossibly, still stretch farther. The mainstream fact, Alexander began planning new campaigns, west toward Arabia, maybe even farther. His mind, always leaping ahead, refused to settle. He staged mass weddings at Susa, marrying his officers to Persian noblewomen, trying to fuse Macedonian and Persian cultures into one empire. To many Greeks, it seemed shocking, even outrageous. But to Alexander, it was inevitable. One people, one world, one destiny. And here's the quirky tidbit. At a grand banquet, Alexander supposedly drank a massive bowl of unmixed wine in honor of Heracles. Soon after, he fell violently ill. Some claimed poison, others blamed the sheer recklessness of gulping down enough alcohol to drown a mule. Historians still argue whether he was assassinated, struck by malaria, or simply undone by fever and exhaustion. You stand nearby in the palace chamber, the air thick with incense, and watch as the strongest man alive suddenly trembles with weakness. The decline is swift. Alexander lies on his bed, too weak to rise, whispering commands to his generals. The soldiers crowd the courtyard, desperate to see him. He cannot speak, but when they file past his bed, he raises his hand in silent farewell. You feel the ache in your chest, the lump in your throat, as the conqueror who never stopped moving lies still at last. Fact again, when asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander reportedly said, "To the strongest." Historians still debate whether he truly uttered those words, or whether they were crafted later to justify the bloody struggles that followed. Either way, the empire fractured almost immediately after his death, carved apart by his ambitious generals. His vision of unity dissolved as quickly as it had formed. And yet, even in death, Alexander's legend grew. His body was preserved in honey, transported in a magnificent procession. Cities bore his name across continents, from Egypt to Central Asia. Stories of his feats spread, half fact, half myth, until he was no longer just a man, but a figure of eternal fascination. You can almost hear the quiet voice of history itself murmuring. He died young, but he burned brighter than anyone before him. The quirky human note: some said that after his death his soldiers cut their hair short in mourning, while others claimed they carried small jars of sand from the battlefields they had shared with him. Tiny tokens, fragile gestures, to hold on to the impossible journey they had taken together. You imagine them sitting by their fires, staring into the distance, wondering if they had followed a mortal king or a god in disguise. And now, the wind down begins. The tempo of footsteps slows, the voices in the courtyard fade, the great halls of Babylon are hushed, and the torches burn low. You watch Alexander's breath grow shallow, his chest rise and fall with effort, until at last it stops. The silence is total. The empire trembles, the world shifts, but in this moment you let yourself soften. You step away from the bed, the incense curling lazily through the air, the walls glowing faintly in the torchlight. The conqueror rests at last, and so, perhaps, can you. The night around you deepens, and your own breath evens out. The battles, the sieges, the marches, all drift away like smoke. What remains is the quiet rhythm of your pulse, the weight of blankets, the simple peace of stillness. The world will argue forever about Alexander, his motives, his brilliance, his flaws, but none of that matters here. What matters is the calm settling into your body, like dust falling gently after a storm. So as you lie there, imagine the Euphrates flowing softly outside Babylon, its waters whispering under the stars. Picture the gardens swaying in the night breeze, the fragrance of roses lingering. Let the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of palm leaves carry you deeper. Your eyelids grow heavy, your body sinks into rest, and the story fades into silence. The world, for once, does not demand conquest. It only asks you to breathe, to release, to let go. The journey has ended, and sleep, like empire, claims you fully now.